There is a specific kind of cruelty that only powerful men perfect, not the battlefield kind, not the obvious brutality that history books condemn and schoolchildren memorize. Something quieter, something worn like cologne at state dinners. Duke Caedric Valecrest kissed another woman in front of his wife before 500 witnesses, and the empire held its breath. Not because it was shocking, but because everyone already knew he could. Stay until the very end tonight. What happens next will change how you understand every empire you have ever admired. The imperial palace of Valemont did not glow. It devoured light. 14,000 candles burned inside crystal chandeliers suspended from vaulted ceilings, painted with conquest murals that stretched longer than city blocks. Gold leaf covered every surface the emperor's architects could reach. Velvet curtains thick enough to muffle artillery fire hung between marble columns, looted from kingdoms that no longer existed on any map. The air smelled of roasted venison, imported wine, and the particular musk of 500 noble bodies pressed together inside a room designed to remind them who owned everything they touched. Winter storms hammered the capital outside. Snow buried entire districts. Peasants froze in doorways 3 streets from the palace gates. Inside, the empire celebrated another military victory nobody could remember the name of anymore. Duke Caedric Valecrest stood at the center of the grand banquet hall, the way a blade stands at the center of a wound. Tall, still, carved from something harder than the marble beneath his boots. He wore black military dress without a single decoration. No medals, no ribbons, no jeweled pins marking 30 years of imperial conquest. That absence said more than any ornament ever could. A man who needed no proof of what he had done to the world. Commander of the imperial legions, master of the western provinces, the emperor's sharpest instrument, a strategist whose campaigns were studied at every war academy across the continent and whose name alone had ended 3 rebellions before a single sword left its sheath. 46 years old, gray threading through dark hair at the temples, a face built from angles rather than curves, eyes the color of winter rivers, pale, clear, and absolutely empty of warmth. Generals bowed when he passed. Ministers paled. Even the emperor watched Caedric Valecrest the way old wolves watch young ones who have grown too strong to challenge directly. And beside the duke stood a woman who was not his wife. Lady Seraphine Vey. Golden hair swept into elaborate braids threaded with silver pins. A gown of white silk cut dangerously low across collarbones sharp enough to draw blood. She moved through the banquet hall attached to Caedric's arm with the casual ownership of someone who had already won a war nobody else realized was being fought. Musicians played, nobles whispered, jeweled fans fluttered like the wings of panicked birds. At the far end of the hall, standing alone near a pillar carved with the Valecrest wolf crest, Duchess Eveline Valecrest watched her husband touch another woman's face. She watched him tilt Seraphine's chin upward with 2 fingers. She watched him lean down slowly, deliberately, savoring the audience the way a commander savors terrain advantage. And she watched him kiss Lady Seraphine Vey in front of every ambassador, general, minister, and noble family that mattered in the known world. The orchestra stumbled. Goblets froze halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-syllable across 300 feet of banquet table. The emperor leaned back upon his gilded throne at the head of the hall. His expression carried the particular amusement of a man watching 2 dogs fight over a bone he had already claimed. Caedric never looked toward his wife. Not during the kiss, not after. Not once. That was the part that would haunt Eveline for years. Not the humiliation, not the public spectacle designed to strip her dignity before witnesses trained since birth to weaponize gossip. Not even the kiss itself. Mouths meeting mouths meant nothing between people who traded affection like currency. It was the absence, complete, deliberate, surgical, as though she had already been removed from his world and nobody had bothered informing her. Eveline Valecrest was 31 years old, dark-haired, pale-skinned beneath the kind of composure that takes a decade of aristocratic survival to build. She wore a black gown that pooled across marble like spilled ink, and her hands remained perfectly still at her sides while the empire watched her husband destroy her. 7 years. 7 years she had managed his estates while he marched armies across continents. She stabilized famine provinces that would have collapsed into rebellion without intervention. negotiated trade agreements that funded his campaigns, settled blood feuds between noble houses that had murdered each other for generations, protected the Valecrest name, the Valecrest fortune, the Valecrest legacy, all while sleeping alone in a palace built for two. She had been brilliant at it. Quietly, invisibly brilliant. The kind of brilliance empires depend upon, but never celebrate, because it happens behind closed doors where no swords are drawn and no flags are planted. Useful. That was the word Caedric used when he described her to military advisors during strategy meetings she was never invited to attend. Eveline is useful, not remarkable, not admired, not loved, useful. The way supply wagons are useful, the way bridge engineers are useful, essential infrastructure that nobody salutes. The banquet hall remained frozen as Eveline began walking forward. Nobles parted instinctively, not out of respect, out of the ancient animal recognition that something dangerous was moving through the crowd, and standing nearby meant becoming collateral. Her heels struck marble with metronomic precision. No tears, no trembling chin, no whispered prayers or clenched fists or any of the theatrical grief the court expected from a humiliated wife. Only stillness, the terrifying stillness of someone who has just realized the building is already on fire and the only remaining question is which door leads out. Caedric noticed her when she was 15 feet away. His expression shifted, not to guilt, not to shame, but to irritation. The mild annoyance of a man whose schedule has been disrupted by something he considered beneath his attention. He released Seraphine's waist. Seraphine stepped aside with a smile that never reached her eyes. The entire court held its breath. Eveline stopped directly in front of her husband, close enough to see the faint scar beneath his left eye where a Caesarean assassin had nearly blinded him 6 years earlier, close enough to smell the wine on his breath and the iron and leather scent that clung to him always, even in peacetime, as though war had soaked permanently into his skin. She said nothing. Instead, she reached down and removed the imperial wedding ring from her left hand. A massive obsidian diamond surrounded by blood-red rubies cut from the first mines ever conquered by House Valecrest 4 generations ago. The stone was famous. Poets wrote about it. Painters included it in portraits. It represented not merely a marriage, but an entire dynasty's claim to permanence. Eveline lifted Caedric's untouched wine glass from the table beside him. She held it at eye level. Then she dropped the ring. The obsidian diamond struck crystal, plunged through crimson wine, and hit the bottom of the glass with a sound that echoed through the silent hall like a stone dropped into a cathedral well. 500 people heard it. 500 people would remember it for the rest of their lives. Eveline set the glass back down on the table in front of her husband. Then she looked into his eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You spent 7 years teaching me what power truly means," she said. Her voice carried no volume, no tremor, no dramatic projection designed to reach the back of the room. It was quiet enough that only Caedric and the nearest dozen nobles heard it clearly. But in a room that silent, whispers traveled like cannon fire. "Tonight, Your Grace, I finally learned." She turned, walked back through the parted crowd, and left the banquet hall without looking back. Behind her, the Empire began whispering. And whispering, in Valemont, was how wars started. Dawn came blood-colored over the capital. The scandal detonated across every noble house before breakfast. Couriers raced between estates carrying sealed letters. Newspapers fought over headlines. Military officers and taverns wagered gold coins over how quickly Duke Valecrest would annul his marriage. Socialites rehearsed their expressions of practiced shock while secretly memorizing every detail for dinner party ammunition. The press called it the fall of the Black Duchess. The name stuck like a blade between ribs. Inside the Valecrest palace, the atmosphere became something you could choke on. Servants moved through corridors with their eyes fixed on floors. Guards stood at posts rigid as statues, terrified of drawing attention. Ministers arrived for morning briefings, looking like men walking toward their own executions. Caedric said nothing. That was what frightened everyone most. Eveline understood why. She had lived beside him long enough to read his silences the way cartographers read terrain. There was the silence before diplomatic negotiations, controlled, measured, already 3 moves ahead. There was the silence before military campaigns, dense and pressurized, like the air before artillery bombardments. and there was this silence. Cold, patient, the silence of a man deciding how much damage to inflict. She found herself standing in her private chambers that first morning, staring at her bare left hand where the ring had lived for 7 years. The skin beneath was paler than the rest, a ghost of something that used to matter. Her lady-in-waiting, Margot, entered carrying tea with shaking hands. "The household staff are requesting instructions, Your Grace." "Instructions for what?" "Whether to prepare your chambers for departure." Eveline looked at her. "Who told them I was leaving?" Margot swallowed. "Lord Havershaw. He informed the senior staff this morning that the Duke's legal counsel has been summoned from the eastern provinces." Legal counsel. Not marriage counsel. Not mediators. Not the kind of professionals you summon when relationships fracture and someone still wants to repair them. Legal counsel meant annulment. Annulment meant erasure. Eveline sat down slowly at her writing desk. Outside, winter light cut through frost-covered windows and laid sharp white lines across documents she had been reviewing the night before. Grain distribution reports from the southern provinces she had personally reorganized after last autumn's floods. 7 years of work. 7 years of holding together an empire's domestic skeleton, while its master chased glory across foreign soil. All of it reducible to a signature on a legal document. "Leave the tea," Eveline said quietly, "and close the door." Margot hesitated. "Your Grace, if I may—" "Close the door, Margot." The door closed. Eveline sat alone in a room she had decorated herself, in a palace she had maintained herself, in a life she had constructed entirely around a man who had just demonstrated before 500 witnesses that she occupied no space whatsoever in his consideration. She did not cry. Crying required believing something had been lost. And you cannot lose something you realize now was never given. What she felt instead was worse. Clarity. The sudden, devastating recognition that every sacrifice, every sleepless administrative night, every diplomatic crisis she navigated alone, every letter she wrote to provincial governors signing his name because he could not be bothered, none of it had been partnership. None of it had been recognized. She had been performing a role in a production whose director had already decided to replace her. The question was whether she would exit quietly through the servants' door or make the Empire watch her leave through the front. 3 days passed in silence. Caedric did not visit her chambers, did not summon her, did not send messages through intermediaries or staff. He continued his routine, morning briefings with military advisors, afternoon inspections of the capital garrison, evening meetings with imperial ministers, as though the banquet had been an unremarkable social event rather than the most talked-about scandal in a generation. Eveline used those 3 days. She reviewed household accounts, financial ledgers, correspondence archives dating back to the first year of their marriage. She mapped every asset, every alliance, every obligation that House Valecrest maintained across the empire. Not because she planned to fight the annulment, because she needed to understand the size of the machine she was trapped inside before she could find the seams. On the third night, a winter storm hammered the capital with the kind of violence that bent iron lampposts and shattered greenhouse glass across noble estates. Lightning turned the sky white every few seconds. Thunder shook the palace walls hard enough to rattle portrait frames. Eveline could not sleep. She walked the palace corridors alone, wrapped in a dark shawl, passing guards who pretended not to see her. Ghosts had more presence in the Valecrest palace than the Duchess these days. Her feet carried her, not consciously, not deliberately, toward the east wing. Caedric's private war chamber, a room she had never been permitted to enter during their entire marriage. His sanctuary, the nerve center where campaigns were designed, alliances forged, enemies catalogued, and eventually destroyed. 2 armed sentries stood outside during normal hours. But at 3 a.m, during a storm violent enough to mask footsteps, the corridor stood empty. The door was locked. Eveline knew where the secondary key was kept because she managed the palace household and knew where everything was kept. That was the irony of being considered merely useful. Useful people learned every secret a building contained simply by maintaining it. The lock turned. The war chamber opened. Inside smelled of old leather, map ink, and candle wax. Military charts covered every wall. Campaign routes traced across continents in red and blue thread pinned to enormous maps. Miniature armies carved from ivory and obsidian stood frozen across a tactical table the size of a dining surface, positioned in formation she recognized from historical battles. This was where Caedric Valecrest truly lived. Not in their marriage bed, not in the banquet halls or throne rooms where politics happened above the surface. Here, surrounded by the geometry of conquest, mapping the destruction of worlds with the same patient precision other men used to tend gardens. Evelyn moved through the room carefully, touching nothing, reading everything her eyes could reach in the dim stormlight filtering through tall windows. Then she found the locked cabinet beneath the tactical table. It opened with the same secondary key. Inside lay documents she was never meant to see. Imperial correspondence bearing the Emperor's personal seal, marriage annulment preparations already drafted and partially signed, property transfer orders reassigning Valecrest holdings, financial agreements redirecting estate revenues, and beneath all of it, a sealed treaty. A marriage alliance between Duke Caedric Valecrest and Lady Seraphine Vey, whose bloodline, Evelyn now discovered, connected directly to a deposed royal house with legitimate claims to 3 eastern provinces the Emperor desperately wanted stabilized. The banquet kiss had never been passion. It had been a political announcement. Caedric was trading his marriage for territory, trading Eveline for an alliance that would make him the most powerful duke in imperial history. The annulment was not punishment for her public defiance at the banquet. It had been planned months before that night ever happened. The banquet humiliation was designed to make her react, to make her look unstable, emotional, irrational, so the Empire would support her removal without questioning the Duke's motives. She had been bait inside her own marriage. Evelyn's hands did not shake as she read the documents. Her breathing did not quicken. Something had shifted inside her chest. Not broken, not collapsed, but rearranged, the way tectonic plates shift beneath continents, silent, massive, irreversible. She replaced every document exactly as she found it, locked the cabinet, locked the door, returned to her chambers through empty corridors while the storm screamed against the palace walls, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, thinking, not grieving, thinking. Because grief was what happened when you lost something accidentally. What Caedric had done was architecture, deliberate, calculated, months of positioning, and architects always left blueprints, which meant somewhere inside those documents lay the structural weakness of the man who believed he had already won. He came to her chambers the following evening. No announcement, no knock. The door simply opened and Caedric Valecrest filled the frame the way he filled every space he entered, completely and without apology. He wore a dark coat unbuttoned at the throat. His boots were still wet from crossing the courtyard in the rain. His face carried the neutral expression of a man attending a routine appointment. "You entered my war chamber last night," he said. Not a question. Evelyn sat at her writing desk. She did not stand, did not turn to face him immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, a response to a provincial tax inquiry, and set down her pen with deliberate calm. "Yes," she said. Caedric closed the door behind him. He crossed the room and stood beside the window where rain streaked glass in crooked silver lines. His reflection watched her from the dark surface. "You read the documents?" "Yes." "And?" She turned in her chair and looked at him for the first time. "And you planned the annulment before the banquet. The kiss was theater. The scandal was manufactured. You needed me to react publicly so the court would blame me for the dissolution." Caedric's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recalculation. The micro-adjustment of a strategist discovering his opponent had moved a piece he had not anticipated. "You understand more than I expected," he said quietly. "You made sure of that. 7 years running your empire while you were away tends to produce competence." Competence. He repeated the word as though tasting it, finding it insufficient. "Is that what you believe you've demonstrated? What would you call it?" Obedience dressed as capability. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat across from her, close enough that their knees almost touched. His voice dropped to the register he used during negotiations, low, unhurried, devastatingly controlled. "You managed estates because I permitted it, negotiated trade routes because I delegated them, resolved provincial crises because they were beneath my attention. You were a steward, Eveline, not a partner. The words landed precisely where he intended them. She felt each one settle into tissue already bruised by years of being diminished so gradually she had mistaken erosion for normalcy. But she did not flinch. A steward, she said, who kept your empire intact while you played conqueror. Played. His jaw tightened, the first visible crack. 30 campaigns, 14 conquered territories. 2 attempted assassinations survived. You call that playing? I call it avoiding everything that frightened you. Silence. The rain intensified against the windows. Somewhere in the palace, a door slammed shut from wind pressure. Elaborate, Caedric said. His voice had gone dangerously flat. Eveline met his gaze and held it. You are the most disciplined man in this empire. The most strategic. The most feared. You can hold a war room's attention for 6 hours without raising your voice. You can dismantle an enemy's supply chain from 400 miles away using nothing but trade embargo timing. You once negotiated a surrender by sending a single letter containing 3 sentences. She paused. But you have never once sat in this room and told me what you actually feel. About anything. In 7 years of marriage, I have received exactly 0 honest sentences from you. Everything has been positioning, performance. The language of a man who learned very young that vulnerability gets people killed and never unlearned it. Caedric stared at her. The room felt suddenly airless. You are describing weakness, he said. I am describing fear. They're the same thing. No. Weakness is not being able to fight. Fear is refusing to stop fighting, even when the war is over. She leaned forward slightly. You conquered 14 territories, Caedric. You could not conquer a single honest conversation with your own wife. Something moved across his face then, fast, buried almost instantly beneath decades of practiced control. Not anger, not contempt. Something older. Something that lived in the locked rooms behind his eyes where the boy he used to be still existed, walled off from the man he had built over that boy, like a fortress over a grave. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stood with his back to her while rain hammered glass and lightning turned the courtyard white. You think you understand me, he said. Everyone does. Generals, ministers, the emperor himself. Everyone believes they have found the key to Caedric Valecrest. They study my campaigns, read my correspondence, analyze my decisions for patterns they can predict. He turned. You are no different. You simply had closer access. Then correct me. Why, Mum? Because in 3 weeks your lawyers will erase me from this family's history. If you're going to destroy someone, you could at least be honest about why. The challenge hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on its point. Caedric studied her for a long moment. His pale eyes moved across her face the way they moved across battlefield terrain, measuring distances, calculating risks, identifying positions of strength and vulnerability. Because you stopped being enough, he said finally, not as a wife, not as a duchess, as a reflection. I needed someone beside me who matched the scale of what I intend to become. And you, Eveline, for all your quiet competence, never once reached for anything larger than maintaining what already existed. Maintaining what exists is how civilizations survive. Civilizations that only maintain themselves are already dying. They simply have not noticed. He walked toward the door, stopped, turned back one final time. You want honesty. Here it is. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I stopped seeing you years ago. Not because you failed, because you never demanded to be seen. And a man like me will devour anyone who does not force him to stop. The door closed behind him. Eveline sat motionless. Rain hammered the world outside. And somewhere inside the devastation of those final words, she recognized something he had not intended to reveal. An admission. Not of guilt. Caedric Valecrest did not traffic in guilt. But of pattern. He had just told her plainly that he consumed people who did not resist him. That his nature was predatory not by choice but by design, that the only people who survived proximity to him were the ones who fought back. He had told her this as a farewell. She received it as a blueprint. The message arrived at midnight. No seal, no signature, delivered by a servant Eveline had never seen before, a young woman who placed the folded paper on her desk, curtsied once, and vanished through the servants' corridor like smoke. 3 sentences, written in a hand she did not recognize. He is not building an alliance. He is building an army. Come to the Eastern Garden Chapel at dawn. Come alone. Eveline read the message twice, then burned it in the candle flame beside her bed. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to rain, and wondered whether she was walking toward salvation or toward the most elegant trap a strategist had ever designed. Dawn would tell. But dawn was still hours away, and the Empire, she was beginning to understand, operated its most dangerous machinery in the dark. The Eastern Garden Chapel had not been used for anything official in over a decade. Ivy strangled the stone columns. Frost cracked the floor tiles into jagged continents. The roof leaked in 3 places where winter storms had peeled away copper sheeting, leaving dark water stains down the walls like old wounds that never stopped bleeding. Eveline arrived 17 minutes before dawn. She wore a hooded traveling cloak over a plain dress. No jewels, no insignia, nothing that identified her as the Duchess of Valecrest, because walking through palace grounds at this hour, looking like a duchess, meant questions from guards, and questions from guards meant reports filed to the man who owned every guard in the building. The chapel was empty. She stood near the far wall where collapsed scaffolding created shadow deep enough to disappear into. Her breath plumed white in the frozen air. Her fingers were numb. She had not eaten since yesterday afternoon, and the emptiness inside her felt less like hunger and more like the hollowed-out lightness that comes after sustained shock, the body stripping itself down to essentials because it understood on some animal level that survival required traveling light. Footsteps. Not from the main garden path. From the servants' tunnel beneath the eastern terrace, a passage most nobles forgot existed because they had never needed to move through the world unseen. A figure emerged from the tunnel entrance wrapped in a dark cloak, smaller than Eveline expected, moving quickly, nervously, with the jerky energy of someone unaccustomed to hiding. The figure lowered her hood. Lady Seraphine Vey looked nothing like the woman from the Banquet. Gone was the golden hair swept into architectural braids. Gone was the silver silk, the dangerous smile, the possessive hand on Caedric's arm. In the gray pre-dawn light, Seraphine looked younger, thinner, exhausted in a way that cosmetics and candlelight had concealed 3 nights ago. Dark circles beneath her eyes, chapped lips, a bruise along her jawline half hidden by the cloak's collar that Eveline's trained eye caught immediately because she had spent 7 years cataloging injuries the Valecrest household tried to keep invisible. "You came," Seraphine said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "You sent the message," Eveline replied. Not warmly, not coldly. The neutral register of a woman who had survived long enough to know that information mattered more than emotion in moments like this. "Talk." Seraphine glanced behind her, checked the tunnel entrance, checked the garden path. Every movement carried the particular hypervigilance of prey animals who have lived too long inside a predator's territory. "He is going to take the throne." The words fell between them like stones into still water. "I know about the marriage alliance," Eveline said. "I read the documents." "The marriage alliance is a decoy." Seraphine stepped closer. Her voice dropped to something barely above breathing. "The treaty you found, the one connecting my bloodline to the eastern provinces, that is real. But it is not the endgame. It is the justification." "Justification for what?" "Invasion." Silence. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, a chapel bell in the city rang 5 times for the hour. The sound traveled across frozen rooftops and arrived muffled, distant, like a warning delivered too late. "Caedric has been repositioning the Western legions for 11 months, Seraphine continued. "Not toward the border territories, toward the capital. He moves companies in small groups, 40 soldiers here, 60 there, reassigning them through routine transfer orders that nobody questions because he controls the military command structure. By spring, he will have 9,000 soldiers within 3 days' march of the Imperial Palace." Eveline's chest tightened, not with surprise. She had lived beside a strategist long enough to recognize the shape of large-scale planning even when individual moves appeared random. Troop rotations she had noticed in household correspondence suddenly rearranged themselves inside her mind like scattered pieces of a mosaic snapping into position. The Emperor knows none of this, she said. The Emperor trusts him completely. That is the weapon. Seraphine's eyes were wet, not from grief, from exhaustion, the particular fatigue of carrying dangerous knowledge alone for too long. Caedric told me himself, 3 weeks ago, in his war chamber, after the arrangements for your annulment were finalized. He told you. He tells me many things. That is my function. Seraphine's mouth twisted. I am not his lover, Evelyn. I have never been his lover. I am his performance, his theater piece. A woman with royal blood who looks stunning on his arm and makes the Empire believe his ambitions extend no further than an advantageous remarriage. The admission restructured everything Evelyn thought she understood about the last 3 months. The banquet kiss, she said slowly. Staged. Rehearsed. He told me where to stand, when to smile, how to touch his arm. He choreographed it the way he choreographs cavalry formations. Seraphine pulled her cloak tighter. I was supposed to make you react, to give him grounds for the annulment, to make the court pity him. The great duke burdened with an unstable wife while a beautiful new prospect waited in the wings. And you agreed to this. I did not have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Seraphine looked at her then with something raw behind her eyes. Not defiance, something older. The look of a person explaining water to someone who has never been thirsty. My family owes House Valecrest 400,000 gold imperials in military debts accumulated during the Eastern campaigns. My father died owing Caedric money that 3 generations of Vays could not repay. When the Duke approached me 6 months ago with his proposal, the alternative was the complete financial destruction of every living member of my house. She paused. So yes, everyone has a choice. Mine was between performing a kiss at a banquet and watching my mother lose her home. Evelyn absorbed this in silence. The machinery was larger than she had imagined, not just a marriage annulment, not just a political remarriage, an entire network of leverage, debts, dependencies, manipulated loyalties, all feeding toward a single objective so massive that the individual cruelties required to build it seem small by comparison. Why are you telling me this? Evelyn asked. Because once he takes the throne, he will erase everyone who knows how he got there. Seraphine's voice steadied. Something harder emerged beneath the fear. I am a loose end. You are a loose end. Your household staff who have seen documents they should not have seen, loose ends. My family, who know the debt arrangement was coerced, loose ends. He does not leave witnesses, Evelyn. You know this. You have seen the aftermath of his campaigns, clean, quiet, no survivors who might contradict the official history. A bird somewhere in the frozen garden began singing, a single thread of sound cutting through gray air, dawn arriving despite everything. What do you want from me? Evelyn asked. Seraphine reached inside her cloak and withdrew a leather folio, thin, worn, sealed with unmarked wax. Troop movement records, financial transfers routed through shadow accounts in the merchants' quarter, correspondence between Caedric and 3 generals who have already sworn loyalty to him over the Emperor. She held out the folio. Enough to prove the coup if delivered to the right hands. Evelyn stared at the folio without taking it. The right hands being whom? Lord Chancellor Aldrich Voss. He commands the Imperial Guard independently of the military. He answers only to the Emperor, and he has suspected Caedric for months, but has no evidence. Voss is a bureaucrat. Voss controls 1,200 palace guards, and the only armed force in the capital that Caedric does not command. He is the only wall between your husband and the imperial throne. Evelyn looked at the folio, then at Seraphine, then at the gray sky brightening beyond the chapel's broken roof. A choice. Not the kind that announced itself with dramatic music and obvious moral clarity, the kind that arrived disguised as a logistics problem. Papers changing hands in a frozen garden while the Empire slept and the most dangerous man alive lay 300 yards away behind palace walls, thick enough to stop cannon fire. If I take those documents to Voss, Evelyn said quietly, I am declaring war on my own husband. You declared war 3 nights ago when you dropped your ring into his wine. You simply had not realized it yet. The words landed with the precision of something that had been thought about carefully, probably rehearsed during sleepless hours in a borrowed room in the East Wing, where a woman pretending to be a duke's mistress sat alone, knowing the performance would eventually cost her everything. Evelyn took the folio. She did not go to Lord Chancellor Voss. Not yet. Because Evelyn Valecrest had spent 7 years learning from the greatest military strategist of his generation, and the first principle of strategy she had absorbed, not from books, not from lectures, but from watching Caedric dismantle opponents across 1,000 dinner conversations, was this: never deploy intelligence before verifying it independently. Seraphine's documents could be authentic. They could also be bait. A test designed by Caedric to see whether his soon-to-be-discarded wife could be provoked into treason before the annulment was finalized. Hand her evidence of a coup. Watch her run to the Chancellor. Then destroy her credibility by proving the documents fabricated, leaving the Duke vindicated and the Duchess branded as a desperate woman who invented conspiracies to avoid her own humiliation. It was exactly the kind of operation Caedric would design. Elegant, multi-layered, turning an enemy's desperation into a weapon against themselves. So Evelyn did what 7 years of invisible empire management had trained her to do. She verified. For 2 days she worked in silence, moved through the palace performing her usual routines, reviewing household accounts, meeting with kitchen staff, attending to correspondence. While beneath that surface normality, she traced every claim in Seraphine's documents against records she already had access to. Troop transfer orders. She cross-referenced them against garrison reports filed through the household office, where military logistics intersected with supply chain management. The numbers matched. Companies reassigned through routine orders that individually meant nothing but collectively described a massive repositioning of force toward the capital. Financial transfers. She checked them against merchant accounts she maintained relationships with through years of managing Valecrest trade obligations. Shadow accounts existed exactly where Seraphine's documents claimed. Money moving in patterns designed to look like commercial activity, but carrying the unmistakable signature of military funding. Large sums broken into smaller transactions, dispersed across multiple institutions, converging eventually toward weapons suppliers and cavalry outfitters. The correspondence was harder to verify. She could not access the general's private letters without exposing herself. But she knew the names: General Ardeth Crowe, General Matthias Rohn, General Isla Drummond, 3 of the 5 highest-ranking military commanders in the Western legions, all personally appointed by Caedric, all owing their positions, their fortunes, and their family estates to his patronage, loyal to the Duke, not to the crown. The distinction had always existed. Evelyn simply had never understood its implications until now. By the second evening, she was certain. The documents were real. Caedric Valecrest intended to overthrow the emperor. She waited until the palace quieted after midnight, then moved through corridors she knew better than anyone alive, past the kitchens, through the servants' wing, down a narrow staircase built during a previous century's renovation that connected the domestic quarters to the administrative wing without passing through any guarded checkpoint. Lord Chancellor Caedric Voss maintained private offices on the 3rd floor of the administrative wing. A spare, meticulous man in his late 50s who dressed in the same dark gray coat every day and spoke in sentences so precisely constructed they sounded like legal documents read aloud. The imperial court found him boring. Ministers dismissed him as a glorified clerk. Caedric referred to him as the emperor's filing cabinet, useful for organization, incapable of independent thought. Evelyn suspected they were all wrong. She had interacted with Voss over 7 years of administrative overlap, tax coordination, provincial governance disputes, household budget reviews required by imperial law. In every meeting, she noticed the same thing. The chancellor listened more than he spoke, remembered details others forgot, asked questions that seemed mundane but later proved to be precisely targeted at inconsistencies nobody else had caught. Boring men did not survive 3 decades in imperial politics. They got eaten in the first year. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. A long pause. Then footsteps. The door opened to reveal Voss in a dressing gown, reading spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, holding a lamp that cast wavering light across a face that showed no surprise whatsoever at finding the Duchess of Valecrest standing outside his private office at 1 in the morning. "Your Grace," he said calmly, I have been expecting someone, though I confess I assumed it would be someone less interesting. She held up the leather folio. May I come in? Voss looked at the folio, looked at her face, read something in her expression that made his eyes sharpen behind those spectacles. He stepped aside. The office was exactly what she expected. Immaculate, organized, every surface clear except for a single desk covered in neatly stacked documents. A fire burned low in the grate. Maps of the capital hung on one wall marked with colored pins she did not have time to study. Voss closed the door, locked it, drew a heavy curtain across the window. Then he sat behind his desk and folded his hands. Talk, he said. Evelyn set the folio on the desk. Troop movements, financial records, correspondence. My husband intends to take the imperial throne by force before spring. Voss did not open the folio. He watched her face instead. And you discovered this how? Lady Seraphine Vey. She is not his mistress. She is his fabrication. He controls her through her family's debts. I know. Evelyn stopped. You know about Seraphine? I know about the debts. I know about the staging. I suspected the banquet performance was manufactured but could not prove it. Voss finally reached for the folio, opened it, scanned the first page with the speed of a man who read thousands of documents daily. What I did not have was this. He turned pages. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes moved faster as he progressed through the material. How long have you suspected him? Evelyn asked. 14 months, since the Caesaran campaign ended, and he refused to demobilize the Western Reserve legions. The stated reason was border instability. The actual reason, I believed, was force preservation. But without evidence of intent, suspicion is merely gossip. And the Emperor? Voss looked up from the documents. His expression carried something she had never seen on his face before. Not fear, but the controlled tension of a man standing at the edge of a decision that could not be reversed. The Emperor trusts Duke Valecrest the way aging men trust the strongest person in the room, not because they believe that person is loyal, because they cannot afford to believe otherwise. He closed the folio. If I bring this evidence to the throne, one of two things happens. Either the Emperor acts decisively and we neutralize the coup before it launches, or the Emperor hesitates. Caedric discovers the exposure, and everyone connected to this conversation is dead within the week. The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward. Which outcome do you consider more likely? Evelyn asked. Voss studied her for a long moment. The lamp between them threw shadows across his face that aged him 10 years. Your Grace, I must ask you something, and I require an honest answer, not a political answer, not a strategic answer, an honest one. Ask. Why are you doing this? The question sat between them with unexpected weight. Why? Not how. Not when. Not what are the logistics. Why? The kind of question that stripped away tactics and alliances and intelligence documents and forced a person to stand in front of their own reflection and describe what they actually saw. Evelyn could have said duty, could have said patriotism, could have said the empire deserved protection from a tyrant, all true, all insufficient. Because 3 nights ago, my husband told me he stopped seeing me years ago, she said. And I realized I had stopped seeing myself even longer before that. I gave 7 years to a man who consumed everything I offered and never once considered what it cost. And now he intends to do to this entire empire what he did to our marriage. Take everything, acknowledge nothing, and destroy anyone who notices. She paused. I am not doing this for the Emperor. I am doing this because if I do not, then everything I lost was lost for nothing, and I refuse to accept that. Voss held her gaze. Then he nodded once. We have a problem, he said. He stood and walked to the wall map of the capital, pointed to the colored pins. These are the troop positions I have been tracking independently. Your documents confirm my estimates. 9,000 soldiers within striking distance by early spring. My Imperial Guard numbers 1,200. Well-trained, loyal to the crown, but outnumbered 7-1. So we cannot fight him directly. Not with force alone. No. Voss turned from the map. But military coups do not succeed through numbers. They succeed through speed and secrecy. If we remove the secrecy, if we expose his plan before he is ready to execute, He loses the single advantage that makes the operation viable. Expose it to whom? You just said the emperor might hesitate. Not the emperor alone. The noble council, the provincial governors, the foreign ambassadors. If the evidence becomes public, Caedric cannot launch the coup without looking like exactly what he is, a traitor, and he will not risk his legacy on a war the Empire has already decided he deserves to lose. Evelyn saw the shape of it. Not a military counter-operation, a political one. Information as artillery, reputation as fortification. The tools she had spent 7 years mastering without realizing she was building an arsenal. This requires allies inside the noble houses, she said. People willing to stand against the most powerful duke in the empire before they know whether they are on the winning side. Yes, that is a difficult sell. I know someone who might help. Voss returned to his desk. Lady Seraphine Vey carries royal blood. If she publicly denounces the duke's manipulation, confirms the fabrication, the coercion, the staged romance, it transforms the narrative. Caedric loses the marriage alliance justification. The annulment collapses. And every noble house reassesses which side of this conflict they want their name recorded on. Seraphine is terrified. Everyone useful in moments like these is terrified. The question is whether terror makes them run or makes them fight. Evelyn thought of Seraphine in the frozen chapel, the bruise along her jawline, the cracked voice, the leather folio extended with hands that trembled. She had already answered that question. There is something else, Evelyn said, something you need to understand before we proceed. Voss waited. Caedric will discover this. He discovers everything. He has informants inside every institution in this city, including yours. Whatever we build, he will find it, and when he does, he will not respond with politics. He will respond with war. Voss removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, replaced them. Then we had better ensure that when he finds it, he is already too late. Evelyn looked at the map on the wall. 9,000 soldiers represented by colored pins, 1,200 guards standing between order and annihilation, a chancellor who might be brilliant or might be desperately outmatched, a terrified woman with royal blood hiding in the East Wing, and herself, the discarded wife of the most dangerous man alive, carrying stolen intelligence in a dead garden chapel like a character in a war story she never asked to star in. She had spent 7 years learning to manage empires. Now she would learn whether that education was enough to save one. The knock came at 3 a.m, not on her chamber door, on the wall behind her wardrobe. 3 sharp raps followed by 2 slow ones, the old servant's signal used during palace renovations when construction workers needed to communicate between sealed rooms. Nobody alive should have known that code. Evelyn opened the hidden panel behind the wardrobe, a narrow passage built during the original palace construction, designed for emergency evacuation, forgotten by everyone except the woman who maintained the household blueprints. Margot stood in the passage, white-faced, shaking. "He knows," Margot whispered. "Lord Havershaw intercepted a courier between the Chancellor's office and the Provincial Hall. The Duke has the letter. He has everything." The heir left the room. When? An hour ago. He recalled the Western garrison commanders to the palace, all 3. Margot's voice broke. "Your Grace, soldiers are moving through the eastern corridors. The household guard has been replaced. I counted 40 armed men in Valecrest livery between here and the main hall. 40 men. Not the 9,000, not the full invasion force. The advance guard. The surgical team a strategist deploys when the timeline accelerates, and the original plan must compress from months into hours. Caedric was not going to wait until spring. Caedric was going to move tonight." Evelyn closed the passage panel, turned, crossed the room, opened her writing desk and removed a document she had prepared 2 days ago. A sealed letter addressed to every provincial governor in the empire, containing copies of Seraphine's evidence and her own testimony, ready for distribution through a courier network she had built over 7 years of managing Valecrest logistics. A network Caedric did not control, because he had never considered household courier routes worth monitoring. Useful things, he once called them, beneath his attention. She handed the document to Margot. "The secondary courier office in the merchant's quarter. The night clerk is Thomas Rent. He owes me a favor from the flood relief operations. Tell him the Blackwell Protocol." Margot stared at her. "Your Grace, the streets." "Margot." Eveline gripped her shoulders. "If those letters do not leave this city within the hour, there will not be a city left to send them from." Margot took the document, disappeared into the passage. The panel closed. Eveline stood alone in her chambers. Through the walls, she could hear boots on marble, the deep, rhythmic percussion of soldiers moving in formation through palace corridors, doors being sealed, positions being taken. The coup was beginning. And somewhere in this palace, Caedric Valecrest was coming for her. Not tomorrow, not at dawn. Now. Eveline did not run. Running was what prey did when it heard the branch snap. Running was instinct stripped of calculation. And calculation was the only weapon she had left in a palace being swallowed by soldiers who answered to a man she had just tried to destroy. She dressed quickly, dark wool, flat boots meant for walking, not for court appearances. She pulled her hair back with a plain cord and slid a small knife from the drawer beside her bed. Not a weapon, not really. A letter opener with a blade no longer than her finger. But the weight of it inside her sleeve settled something in her nervous system that felt dangerously close to calm. Boots in the corridor outside, 4 men, moving east. She pressed her ear against the door and counted their rhythm until it faded. Then she moved. Not toward the main halls, not toward the chancellor's offices where Voss presumably sat surrounded by 1,200 guards who might or might not be enough to stop what was coming. She moved downward, through the servants' staircase behind the linen closets, through a cellar passage that connected the domestic wing to the palace kitchens, through the kitchens themselves, dark now, cold, iron pots hanging from ceiling hooks like the skeletons of enormous bells. She knew every passage in this building, every locked door and forgotten corridor and bricked-over tunnel that appeared on household maintenance blueprints. Nobody read except the woman responsible for keeping the palace from collapsing around its own arrogance. 7 years of being invisible had given her the architecture of escape. The irony tasted like metal in her mouth. She reached the kitchen courtyard, a narrow space between the main palace and the service buildings where delivery carts unloaded supplies during daylight hours. Empty now. Snow covered the cobblestones in a thin crust that would record footprints. Eveline stopped, listened. Wind. The distant clatter of soldiers somewhere inside the east wing. A horse stamping in the stables 200 yards away. She crossed the courtyard quickly, staying tight against the wall where the overhang prevented snow from accumulating. Reached the service gate. The lock required a key she carried on the same ring as the war chamber key, the household master set that Caedric had never bothered to confiscate because he categorized domestic infrastructure as beneath strategic relevance. The gate opened, and Lord Havershaw was standing on the other side. Caedric's chief of staff, a tall, thin man with a scholar's posture and an executioner's eyes. He wore a military coat over civilian clothes and held a lantern that threw amber light across his narrow face and the 4 armed soldiers standing behind him in a tight formation. "Your Grace," Havershaw said. His voice carried the same courteous flatness he used when announcing dinner guests. "The Duke requests your presence." Eveline's hand tightened around the letter opener inside her sleeve. Useless. A blade the size of a finger against 5 men carrying swords. The mathematics of violence reduced to absurdity. "Requests," she repeated. Havershaw's thin mouth compressed into something that was not quite a smile. "Insists." 2 of the soldiers stepped forward and flanked her, not touching, not yet, but close enough that the warmth of their bodies pressed against the frozen air around her like walls closing inward. She released the letter opener, let it slide back into her sleeve, let her shoulders drop half an inch in a posture she had practiced through 100 hostile negotiations. The deliberate relaxation that told an opponent you had accepted the situation while your mind raced through every remaining exit. "Lead the way," she said. They escorted her back through the service gate, through the kitchen courtyard, through corridors that now held soldiers at every intersection, Valecrest men, armed, watchful, their silver wolf insignia catching lamplight as Eveline passed. She counted them. 14 in the domestic wing alone. Extrapolating across the full palace complex meant at least 100 soldiers deployed inside the building. The advance guard had grown. Whatever Caedric was doing, he was doing it fast. They brought her to the Great Hall, not the banquet hall where the scandal had erupted 3 nights ago. The Great Hall, the older, darker space at the palace's heart where House Valecrest conducted its private political operations. Stone walls, iron chandeliers, a fireplace large enough to stand inside that threw shifting red light across a room designed during a century when architecture served intimidation before aesthetics. Caedric stood beside the fireplace. He had changed since their last conversation. Not clothes, he wore the same dark coat, the same boots, but something in the way he occupied space. The controlled stillness she recognized from years of watching him prepare for military engagements had intensified into something denser, something that compressed the air around him until breathing near him felt like work. His pale eyes tracked her entry the way targeting mechanisms track movement. No warmth, no anger, something worse than both. The absolute focus of a man who has decided the time for negotiation is over and every remaining interaction is triage. Chancellor Voss stood against the far wall. His hands were bound behind his back. His spectacles were missing. A bruise darkened the left side of his face, and blood from a split lip had dried in a thin line down his chin. 2 soldiers held his arms. His expression, despite everything, remained eerily composed. The bureaucratic calm of a man who had always understood that this outcome was statistically possible and had simply hoped the probability would remain low. Seraphine knelt on the stone floor near the center of the room, not bound, not visibly injured, but her face was the color of ash, and her body trembled with the fine, continuous vibration of someone whose nervous system had abandoned higher function and retreated to pure survival response. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. She did not look up when Eveline entered, and standing beside Caedric, holding a sheaf of documents Eveline recognized immediately as copies of the letters she had given Margot 2 hours ago, was Margot herself. The world stopped. Not metaphorically, not dramatically. Something in Eveline's cognitive processing simply halted, the way a machine halts when it encounters input that contradicts every operating assumption it was built upon. Margot, her lady-in-waiting, the woman who had served her for 5 years, who brought her tea every morning, who had stood shaking in the servants' passage 90 minutes ago with tears on her face and terror in her voice saying, "He knows, he knows, he knows." Margot did not meet her eyes. She stood rigid beside the Duke, clutching Eveline's documents against her chest, and stared at a fixed point on the wall behind Eveline's head with the blank expression of someone who had severed every emotional connection to the present moment in order to survive it. "Sit down," Caedric said. Not loudly, not forcefully. The quiet instruction of a man who understood that real authority never needed volume. A chair had been placed in the center of the room, isolated, positioned so that anyone sitting in it would face Caedric, Voss, and Seraphine simultaneously. The geometry of an interrogation designed to make the subject feel surrounded even in an open space. Eveline sat. Her legs carried her there because her legs still functioned, even though the rest of her felt like a building whose foundation had just been removed. She sat and placed her hands flat on her thighs and forced her breathing into a rhythm that mimicked calm because the alternative was the kind of visible collapse that men like Caedric fed on. Margot. 5 years. 5 years of trust built through daily proximity, through shared silence during difficult nights, through the accumulated intimacy of routine that becomes, if you are not careful, indistinguishable from loyalty. The body processed betrayal before the mind did. Eveline felt it as heat first, a flush climbing her throat and spreading across her chest like internal bleeding, then cold, then nothing. A numbness that settled over her nervous system like frost covering a window. Not protection, just the body's emergency protocol for situations where feeling everything at once would be physically dangerous. Margot has been reporting to Lord Havershaw for 14 months, Caedric said. He walked slowly from the fireplace toward the center of the room, each step measured. Household observations, your private correspondence, your emotional state after significant events, the names of everyone you spoke with privately. He stopped in front of Eveline's chair. I knew about the Garden Chapel meeting before it happened. I knew Seraphine would bring you documents because I allowed her to obtain them. I knew you would verify the intelligence independently because I designed the evidence trail to withstand exactly the kind of cross-referencing your administrative training would produce. The fire cracked behind him. Sparks rose. And I knew you would go to Voss because he is the only institutional authority in this capital positioned to challenge me, and you have always, always chosen institutional solutions over personal ones. It is the most predictable thing about you. Eveline stared at him. Everything she had done in the last 3 days, every careful verification, every calculated risk, every moment she believed she was seizing initiative, had been anticipated, managed, incorporated into a larger design she could not see because she was inside it. She was not the strategist in this room. She was the campaign. The documents Seraphine gave you are real, Caedric continued. The troop movements are real. The financial transfers are real. The correspondence with the generals is real. I allowed you to find authentic intelligence because fabricated evidence would not have survived your verification process, and I needed you to believe completely before you acted. Why? The word left her mouth before she could stop it. Dry, cracked, the voice of someone breathing smoke. Caedric studied her the way he studied fortification blueprints, measuring structural integrity, identifying load-bearing walls, calculating exactly how much pressure to apply before collapse. Because the Emperor has suspected me for 6 months, not because of my troop positions, not because of Voss's colored pins on his wall map, because someone inside my own command structure has been feeding intelligence to the Imperial Court, and I have spent 4 months trying to identify who. He glanced toward Voss. The Chancellor is not the investigator. He is the conduit. Someone is using him to pass information to the Emperor without leaving traces that lead back to my military network. He turned back to Eveline. I needed to flush that person out, and the fastest way to flush an informant from hiding is to create a crisis that forces every hidden player to move simultaneously. The scope of it crashed over Eveline like black water. The Banquet scandal, the annulment documents, Seraphine's midnight visit, the evidence folio, the manufactured urgency. All of it, every piece, had been designed not to remove Eveline from the marriage, but to use her as a detonation device. A controlled explosion meant to shake the intelligence network hard enough that the real informant would break cover. You used me as bait, Eveline said. I used you as terrain, Caedric corrected. His voice carried no malice, no satisfaction, only the exhausted precision of a commander explaining operational logic after the battle has ended. Bait is passive. Terrain shapes the movement of forces. You shaped how Voss responded, how Seraphine moved, how the informant reacted. Every decision you made in the last 3 days created pressure that forced hidden players into visible positions. And Margot? Margot has been my observation post inside your life since the 2nd year of our marriage. He said it without emphasis, without cruelty. A logistical fact. She was not planted to betray you. She was planted to monitor the household for threats I could not see from campaign positions. When I designed this operation, she became the control mechanism, the fail-safe ensuring your actions stayed within parameters I could predict. Eveline looked at Margot. Margot still would not meet her eyes, but her jaw was clenched so tight the muscles trembled visibly, and her knuckles around the documents had gone white. Whatever Margot was, spy, informant, instrument, she was not comfortable. She was enduring this moment the way soldiers endure artillery bombardment, still, silent, praying for it to end. Look at me, Eveline said. Margot did not move. Margot, look at me. Slowly, like a mechanism fighting its own gears, Margot turned her head. Her eyes were red, wet, filled with something that looked remarkably like grief. Not the performance of grief, not the strategic deployment of tears, but the genuine corrosive anguish of a person who understood exactly what they had done and lacked the luxury of pretending it was justified. 5 years, Eveline said quietly. Margot flinched as though struck. Every morning you brought tea to my chambers. Every evening you helped me with correspondence. You were there when the southern floods destroyed 3 provinces, and I worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks. You held my hand when the miscarriage report arrived from the physician, and I could not breathe. You were the only person in this palace I trusted without calculation. Her voice did not break. It flattened, compressed, became something denser and more dangerous than grief. Was any of it real? Margot's mouth opened, closed. Her throat worked around words that would not form. Caedric interrupted. Margot's personal feelings are irrelevant to... I am not speaking to you. Evelyn did not raise her voice, did not turn toward him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Margot with an intensity that made two of the soldiers in the room shift their weight uncomfortably. Was any of it real? A tear slid down Margot's cheek, just one, a single crack in 5 years of maintained deception. All of it, Margot whispered, every single day, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. Silence. The fire consumed another log. The wood splitting sounded like a bone fracturing. Evelyn turned back to Caedric. Something had changed in her face. Not softened, not hardened, reorganized. The way a landscape reorganizes after an earthquake. Same elements, entirely different configuration. The woman who had walked into this room believing she was a strategist playing a dangerous but comprehensible game now understood that the game itself had been a simulation running inside a larger operation she never had access to. And understanding that, fully, cellularly, in the marrow, did something to her that 7 years of emotional erosion had not accomplished. It killed the last remaining part of her that wanted Caedric Valecrest to see her. Because a man who instrumentalized every human being in his proximity, wife, mistress, servant, chancellor, did not see people. He saw functions, roles, load-bearing elements and structures he designed and demolished according to strategic necessity. Wanting to be seen by him was wanting to be recognized by a machine. The desire itself was the trap, and she was done. So, she said. Her voice sounded different now, even to her own ears. Stripped, clean. The voice of someone who has lost everything that can be leveraged and discovered that the absence of leverage is its own kind of freedom. You flushed your informant. You proved Voss is the conduit. You demonstrated that your wife is predictable and your surveillance network is intact. Congratulations. She stood from the chair. Every soldier in the room tensed. What happens now? The annulment proceeds. I am erased. Seraphine performs whatever role you assign her next. Voss disappears into a cell somewhere, and you march on the capital when the snow melts. Caedric watched her stand with an expression she could not read, and she had spent 7 years reading him. Sit down, Evelyn. No. The word dropped between them like a blade. Caedric's eyes narrowed. Not anger. Recalibration. She had moved outside the parameters. The courier network, he said. You sent letters through a logistics system I do not control. Margot retrieved the primary documents, but you would not have relied on a single distribution channel. You're too well trained for that. Evelyn said nothing. Where are the secondary copies? Silence. Evelyn N. You designed me to manage complex operations under pressure, she said. You left me alone for 7 years to build systems you never bothered to understand. And now you want me to dismantle those systems for you because you have suddenly realized that the useful, predictable, invisible Duchess has infrastructure you cannot see. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the pulse in his throat, the faint scar beneath his eye, the micro-tension in his jaw that she had learned to read across 1,000 silent dinners. Ask yourself something, Caedric. In all your planning, in all your surveillance, in all your 14 months of watching me through Margot's eyes, did you ever once consider what happens when someone with nothing left to lose stops performing for the person who took everything? The room held its breath. Caedric stared at her. And for the second time since the banquet, something moved behind those Winter River eyes that he could not fully control. Not fear. She doubted he was capable of fear in the conventional sense, but recognition. The sudden, unwelcome awareness that a variable he had categorized as stable had just become unpredictable. And unpredictable was the one thing Caedric Valecrest could not manage. Havershaw, he said without looking away from her. Secure the merchant's quarter courier office. Detain everyone inside. Already dispatched, Your Grace, Havershaw replied. The secondary routes. The provincial relay stations she would have used for redundant distribution. Cross-reference them against household logistics records from the last 7 years. That will take time. Then start now. Havershaw hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Evelyn to notice, then left the room. Caedric returned his attention to her. You will remain in this palace under guard until I determine the extent of what you have distributed. If the letters reach provincial governors, I will know within 48 hours. If they did not, we will discuss terms. Terms, she repeated. For what? For your future, which, despite what you believe, I have no desire to destroy. He said it evenly, almost gently, the gentle register of a man who genuinely believed he was being merciful. You were a good Duchess, Eveline, better than I acknowledged, but this empire is going to change, and the only question is whether you change with it or get buried beneath it. He turned toward the door, stopped, turned back. One more thing. His voice dropped. The informant inside my command structure, the person feeding intelligence to the Emperor through Voss. I know who it is now, not because of anything you did, because of who did not move tonight. He looked at Voss. Voss looked back at him with the bloody, bruised, devastatingly composed face of a man who had known this moment was coming and had made his peace with it weeks ago. General Isla Drummond, Voss said quietly. She has been reporting to the Crown since the Caesaran campaign. Caedric nodded once. Thank you for confirming. He left the room. Soldiers followed. The door closed. Eveline stood alone in the great hall with a bound chancellor, a kneeling woman who had not spoken in 20 minutes, and the smoldering wreckage of every plan she had believed was hers. Voss spoke first. The secondary courier route. You used the flood relief network. Eveline looked at him. Tomas Rent's office is a decoy, Voss continued. His voice was strained but steady. You sent Margot there knowing she might be compromised. The actual distribution went through the provincial relief coordinators you embedded in the grain supply chain 2 years ago, a system Caedric never audited because it fell under domestic agriculture, beneath his attention. Eveline stared at him. How do you know that? Voss almost smiled, split lip and all. Because General Drummond told me 3 months ago that if the situation deteriorated, you would be the person to build the intelligence distribution network. And she told me to watch for the pattern you would use, redundant civilian logistics masked as domestic infrastructure. The room tilted. Drummond knew about me? Drummond has been watching you longer than Margot has, not as a spy. As an ally, she could not contact directly without exposing both of you. Voss shifted against his bonds. The general recognized years ago that Caedric's wife understood the Empire's supply architecture better than any military commander alive. She told me, and I quote, "When this collapses, the Duchess will be the one standing in the wreckage with a working communications network while every soldier in the country is still looking for their boots." Seraphine finally looked up from the floor. Her eyes were raw, swollen, but something had shifted in them, a dim spark beneath the ash. The letters, Seraphine said. Her voice was ruined but functional. Did they get out? Eveline looked at the fire, at the bound chancellor, at the closed door beyond which the most dangerous man in the Empire was hunting for courier routes he would not find because they ran through grain distribution offices and flood relief stations and agricultural coordinators in 12 provinces who owed their positions to a duchess nobody had considered a threat. Domestic infrastructure, beneath his attention. Useful things. They got out, Eveline said. But even as she said it, the weight of what came next settled across her shoulders, like armor she had not asked to wear. The letters were gone. The evidence was spreading through networks Caedric could not intercept in time. Within days, provincial governors across the Empire would know the truth about the coup. And Caedric would know that she was the one who built the machine that stopped him. Not Voss, not Drummond, not the Emperor. His wife. The woman he had used as terrain. There would be no negotiation after this. No terms. No discussion of futures. When Caedric understood the full scope of what she had done, and he would, because understanding scope was what he did better than any living strategist, the response would not be political. It would be total. She had 48 hours before the most powerful military mind in the Empire turned its full attention toward destroying her, not her reputation, not her title, her. And the woman who would face that destruction could not be the woman who had walked into this room. That woman, the Duchess who managed estates and negotiated trade routes and hoped that competence would someday earn recognition from a man who viewed human connection as structural weakness, that woman was finished, not dead. Finished. The way a chrysalis is finished when whatever lives inside it has outgrown the architecture that once provided safety. Eveline looked at Voss. Can your guards hold the administrative wing? For now, not indefinitely. She looked at Seraphine. Can you stand? Seraphine rose on shaking legs, unsteady but vertical. Evelyn walked to Voss and knelt behind him, drew the letter opener from her sleeve, cut the ropes binding his wrists with 3 precise strokes. Voss rubbed his wrists, looked at the blade. You brought a letter opener to a coup. I brought what I had. She straightened, looked at the door. Beyond it, boots on marble, commands echoing through corridors. The machinery of a military takeover assembling itself piece by piece inside a palace she knew better than the man who owned it. 48 hours. She had 48 hours to become someone Caedric Valecrest had never planned for, and the only way to do that was to stop being anyone he recognized. The first 6 hours belonged to Caedric. His soldiers sealed every gate in the palace complex. Couriers were intercepted at checkpoints across 3 city districts. The merchant's quarter courier office was raided before dawn. Tomas Rent dragged from his desk in nightclothes, his staff detained, his records confiscated. Havershaw's men moved through the capital with surgical efficiency, dismantling communication nodes the way combat engineers dismantled bridges ahead of advancing armies. But they were cutting the wrong wires. Evelyn's actual distribution network did not run through courier offices. It ran through grain warehouses, agricultural inspection stations, flood relief coordination posts embedded in the civilian supply chain across 12 provinces, a logistics skeleton she had built during the Southern Crisis 2 years ago and never decommissioned because nobody had told her to and nobody had noticed she hadn't. Each station was staffed by a provincial administrator who owed their appointment to the Duchess, not the Duke. Each station maintained its own messenger relay. Each relay used civilian trade routes that military intelligence did not monitor because military intelligence considered grain logistics irrelevant to strategic operations. Caedric was hunting for a military network. Evelyn had built a civilian one. The letters were already moving. While Caedric's forces swept the capital, Evelyn worked from the administrative wing under Voss's protection. 1,200 Imperial guards held the wing's perimeter. Not enough to challenge Caedric's growing force directly, but enough to create a contested zone the Duke could not breach without open combat inside the palace itself. And open combat inside the Imperial Palace meant war. Not a quiet coup dressed in legal justification and political maneuvering, actual war. The kind that produced bodies in throne rooms and blood on marble floors, and the sort of images that made empires remember their rulers as butchers rather than liberators. Caedric was not ready for that. Not yet. His plan had always depended on the appearance of legitimacy, the orderly transfer of power from an aging emperor to a worthy successor, supported by military strength that looked like stability rather than conquest. Evelyn's existence inside the administrative wing with the Chancellor and the Imperial Guard shattered that narrative. As long as she held that position, Caedric could not move without looking like exactly what he was. A tyrant besieging his own capital. She understood this not because someone explained it to her, but because she had spent 7 years watching the man calibrate every action against its political optics. Image was not vanity for Caedric Valecrest. Image was infrastructure. The story the Empire told itself about who held power and why, that story was the actual mechanism of control. Armies enforced compliance. Stories created consent. And consent was cheaper than enforcement, which was why every successful ruler in history spent more energy managing narrative than managing soldiers. Caedric would not storm the administrative wing. He would siege it, cut supplies, block communications, wait for the 1,200 guards to realize they were defending a losing position and begin negotiating their own survival independently. Which meant Evelyn did not have 48 hours. She had whatever window existed between now and the moment Caedric's siege made the administrative wing untenable. Voss estimated 36 hours based on food stores and water access. General Drummond, still embedded inside Caedric's command structure, still undiscovered despite Voss's forced confession of her name, estimated less. Communication with Drummond came through a method so primitive it bordered on absurd. Written messages folded inside bread loaves delivered by kitchen staff, moving between the contested wings. The palace kitchens occupied neutral ground. Soldiers from both sides needed to eat, and disrupting food service during a standoff created the kind of low-level mutiny that commanders avoided because hungry men made unpredictable decisions. Drummond's first message arrived at noon. 3 sentences written in charcoal on the inside of a flour wrapper. He recalled Crow and Roan. Full Western garrison mobilizing. You have 20 hours, not 36. Eveline read the message in Voss's office. Read it twice. Burned it in the desk lamp. 20 hours. Generals Ardeth Crow and Matthias Roan were the backbone of Caedric's military command. Their recall meant the full Western garrison, 9,000 soldiers, was now accelerating toward the capital at forced march speed. When they arrived, the administrative wing's 1,200 guards would be outnumbered, outgunned, and irrelevant. "We cannot hold this position," Eveline said. Voss stood at his wall map. The colored pins had been rearranged based on Drummond's intelligence. The visual was bleak, a tightening ring of Valecrest forces surrounding a shrinking pocket of imperial authority like a fist closing around a throat. "No," Voss agreed. "We cannot." "Then we stop trying to hold it." Voss turned. Eveline stood at the desk, covered in documents she had been organizing for the past 6 hours. Administrative records, palace blueprints, communication logs, provincial contact lists. The accumulated paperwork of a woman who had managed a domestic empire while the world dismissed her as useful. "The letters reach provincial governors within 2 days," she said. "When they do, Caedric's coup becomes public knowledge. But 2 days from now, this wing is overrun, and everyone inside it is either dead or imprisoned. The evidence survives. We do not. Unless we stop defending and start moving." "Moving where? The palace is surrounded." "The palace is surrounded above ground." Eveline pulled a blueprint from the stack. Aged vellum. Architectural drawings from the original palace construction. Below ground is a different map. She spread the blueprint across the desk. Voss leaned in. His eyes tracked the network of tunnels, cellars, and evacuations passages threading beneath the palace complex like a root system beneath a forest. "Most of these were sealed during the renovations 40 years ago," Voss said. "Most, not all." Her finger traced a route. The eastern evacuation passage connects the administrative wing cellars to the old city waterworks beneath the merchants' quarter. It was sealed at the palace end with a brick wall but never filled. The waterworks exit is 300 yards from the provincial trade office, where my relief coordinators maintain a permanent relay station. "You're proposing we abandon the administrative wing." "I'm proposing we stop being a fixed target." She looked at him directly. "Caedric's entire strategy depends on knowing where his opponents are. Fixed positions, predictable movements, identifiable concentrations of force he can surround and neutralize. That is how he fights. That is the only way he knows how to fight." She tapped the blueprint. "What happens when there is no position to besiege? When the 1,200 guards disperse into the city through exits he does not know exist? When the evidence network is already beyond his reach, and the only people left in this wing are empty rooms and abandoned desks?" Voss studied the blueprint. His bruised face showed nothing, but his eyes moved with the rapid calculation of a man reassessing every assumption he had built his defense around. "He will hunt us through the city." "He will try." In a capital of 300,000 people, with winter storms reducing visibility and civilian populations who have no loyalty to a duke they have never seen, and every loyalty to the grain supply system that kept them alive during the floods. Silence. "You built that supply system," Voss said slowly. "Yes." "Deliberately?" "Not deliberately. I built it because people were starving and someone needed to manage the logistics. But the infrastructure is there regardless of why it was built. Warehouses, distribution points, communication relays, administrative contacts in every district who know my name, know my authority, and have no reason to cooperate with a military coup that threatens the food security I spent 2 years stabilizing." She straightened. "Caedric built his power on armies. I built mine on grain. And right now, in winter, in a besieged capital, grain is worth more than swords." Voss almost smiled again, that split-lip, battered, bureaucratic almost smile. "When do we move?" "Tonight, after dark, before the Western garrison arrives." "And Seraphine?" Evelyn looked toward the door. Seraphine was in the adjacent room, wrapped in a borrowed coat, sitting motionless in a chair where she had barely spoken since being brought from the Great Hall. She comes with us. Her testimony is the detonator. Without her public confirmation of the staged romance and the coerced alliance, the evidence is documents, convincing but deniable. With her voice attached, it becomes a story the Empire cannot ignore. She is terrified. Everyone in this building is terrified. Terror is not the problem. Paralysis is, and Seraphine chose to move when she brought me those documents in the garden. She chose again when she stood in that great hall and did not recant. She has been choosing, Voss. She just has not realized yet that choosing under fear is still choosing. Drummond's second message arrived at sundown, hidden inside a sack of potatoes delivered to the administrative wing kitchen. Caedric moving personal guard to East Wing. He suspects tunnels. You have hours, not 20. Go now. The charcoal letters were smeared, written fast. The hand that wrote them pressing hard enough to tear the paper in 2 places. Evelyn read it standing in the kitchen. Steam from stock pots clouded the air. Kitchen staff moved around her pretending she was not there, because pretending powerful people were not there was how servants survived regime changes. He suspects tunnels. Not which tunnels, not specifically, but the concept. The idea that the palace contained subterranean routes his surface-level siege could not contain, which meant he was sending soldiers underground to search. How long before they found the Eastern Passage? The palace basement system was extensive. Dozens of corridors, storage rooms, sealed chambers, dead ends. A thorough search would take hours. A targeted search guided by someone who knew the architecture. Margot knew the architecture. Margot had access to the same household blueprints Evelyn used. Margot had accompanied her during infrastructure inspections for 5 years. Margot knew which passages were sealed and which were merely locked, which walls were brick and which were stone, which routes connected where. Caedric was not guessing about tunnels. Margot had told him. The betrayal deepened in layers like geological strata, each new discovery pressing the previous ones into harder, denser formations beneath. Not just surveillance, not just emotional manipulation, active tactical intelligence about escape routes the Duchess might use if cornered. Every comforting detail of their shared history now reconfigured into a reconnaissance map. Evelyn crushed the message in her fist. Now, she said to the kitchen aide standing nearest, tell the Chancellor, now. The next 40 minutes moved with the compressed, airless intensity of a controlled demolition. Voss deployed orders through the Imperial Guard chain of command. Not written orders, spoken, face-to-face, officer to officer, because written orders could be intercepted, and every person in the administrative wing understood that information security now meant the difference between escape and execution. The 1,200 guards divided into 3 groups. 400 would maintain visible positions along the administrative wing perimeter, keeping lanterns lit and patrols active to maintain the illusion of continued occupation for as long as possible. 400 would disperse through secondary exits, servant passages, coal chute accesses, maintenance tunnels, into the city in civilian clothes, carrying sealed orders to rally at designated positions across 6 districts. The remaining 400 would escort Evelyn, Voss, and Seraphine through the eastern evacuation passage to the waterworks exit. But Evelyn changed the plan. Not 400 guards through the eastern passage, 50. If Caedric's soldiers are already searching the tunnels, 400 people moving through a single corridor create noise, light, and a concentration of force that turns us into exactly the kind of target we are trying to stop being, she told Voss in his office, while guards outside packed essential documents into waterproof satchels. 50 people move quietly. 400 sound like an army. 50 guards cannot protect you if we encounter resistance underground. 400 guards cannot protect me either if we are trapped in a tunnel with no room to maneuver. Numbers are irrelevant in confined spaces. Speed matters. Silence matters. Knowing the route better than the people searching for us matters. Voss hesitated. The military logic was sound, but the protective instinct was screaming. Reducing the escort meant reducing the margin for error to nearly 0. Redistribute the remaining 350 into the city dispersal groups, Evelyn said. More bodies in the city means more rally points, more flexibility, more capability to act when the provincial response arrives. Voss looked at her, really looked. The way he had looked at her that first night in his office when she brought him the leather folio, and he realized the Duchess was not what anyone had assumed. "You have changed," he said. "No, I stopped hiding." "There is a difference? Ask me in 20 hours. They moved at full dark. Evelyn led. Not because she was the ranking authority, not because protocol demanded it, because she was the only person alive who had walked the eastern evacuation passage during a routine infrastructure inspection 3 years ago, and knew that the sealed brick wall at the palace end was only 2 courses thick, a cosmetic barrier installed during renovations, not a structural one, and that the mortar had been degrading since before her marriage, because the passage flooded every spring, and nobody had authorized repairs because nobody cared about infrastructure, nobody used. The cellar beneath the administrative wing smelled of stone, standing water, and centuries of accumulated dampness. Torchlight threw monstrous shadows across walls slick with mineral deposits. 50 guards moved in single file behind her, their boots splashing through ankle-deep water that was cold enough to burn. Voss walked behind Evelyn, Seraphine behind Voss, supported by a guard on each side because her legs kept threatening to fold. The passage narrowed, ceiling dropped. The air thickened with the particular staleness of enclosed underground spaces where ventilation had ceased decades ago. Then they reached the brick wall, 2 courses thick, mortar crumbling, moisture stains bleeding through the surface in patterns that mapped the spring flooding Evelyn had documented in a maintenance report nobody had read. She touched the wall, pushed, felt it give slightly beneath her palm. "Quietly," she whispered. 2 guards moved forward with iron tools. They worked the mortar in silence, prying bricks free one at a time and passing them backward along the line. Each brick removal sounded enormous in the tunnel's acoustics, every scrape and click amplified by stone walls into something that felt like it could be heard for miles, even though the rational part of her mind knew that underground sounds traveled poorly through solid rock. The wall thinned, cold air from the far side pressed through gaps between bricks. Not the dead air of a sealed tunnel, moving air. Air connected to the outside world. The final bricks came free. Beyond the wall, the passage continued, wider, older, the stonework rougher, predating the palace by centuries. The original city waterworks, a labyrinth of channels and service tunnels built beneath the capital when the merchants' quarter was still a fishing village, and infrastructure meant keeping the river from flooding market squares. Evelyn stepped through. Her boots hit dry stone. The air was cold but breathable, carrying the distant mineral scent of underground water. She raised her torch. The passage extended forward into darkness, curving slightly to the left along a gradient that would carry them beneath the palace grounds, under the outer walls, and into the waterworks system beneath the commercial district. 300 yards to the exit, 300 yards to the trade office relay station, 300 yards to a communications network Caedric could not reach. She started walking. Behind her, 50 guards filed through the breached wall. Seraphine passed through, supported by soldiers, her face white, her breathing shallow but controlled. The disciplined breathing of someone managing panic through pure mechanical effort. They were 200 yards into the waterworks when the sound reached them. Boots, not from behind, from ahead, echoing through the stone tunnel with the distinct rhythmic pattern of soldiers moving in formation, coming toward them, growing louder with each heartbeat. Evelyn stopped. The column behind her stopped. Silence except for breathing and the distant percussion of approaching boots. Caedric had not just sent soldiers to search the palace tunnels. He had sent them into the waterworks from the merchants' quarter end, both ends of the passage. Sealed. The trap was not above ground. The trap was here, underground, in the dark, in a stone corridor with no exits and no room to maneuver and 50 guards against whatever force was marching toward them through tunnels that the most brilliant military strategist of his generation had apparently understood far better than anyone believed. Margot had not just known the evacuation passage, she had known the waterworks. She had accompanied Evelyn on the inspection 3 years ago. She had stood beside her while Evelyn traced the route on the blueprint. She had watched, listened, memorized, reported everything to a man who filed information the way other people filed weapons, stored indefinitely, deployed precisely, never wasted. Approaching boots grew louder. Voss drew his sword. Around him, guards shifted into defensive formation, their movements constrained by the tunnel's width to a front line of 3 men across. 50 against unknown numbers in a stone corridor lit by torches that made everyone a visible target and nobody a hidden one. Eveline's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. Her hand shook. Not with fear, or not only with fear, but with the full-body adrenaline surge of an animal whose escape route has just become a kill zone. Then the approaching torchlight appeared around the curve ahead, and the first face it illuminated was Caedric's. He walked at the head of his soldiers. No helmet, no drawn sword, his dark coat buttoned to the throat, and his pale eyes catching torchlight like chips of ice floating in amber. He moved through the tunnel the way he moved through every space, completely, inevitably, as though the environment had been designed specifically to accommodate his passage. Behind him, soldiers filled the tunnel 3 abreast. 30. 40. More still emerging from the curve. Caedric stopped 20 feet from Eveline's position. His soldiers stopped behind him. The 2 columns faced each other in a stone corridor beneath the Capitol, while the empire above them slept and the distance between them narrowed to a strip of damp stone no wider than a banquet table. Caedric looked at her. Not at Voss. Not at the guards. Not at Seraphine barely standing behind the escort line. At her. "The grain network," he said. His voice echoed off stone. "I did not see it. Not until 3 hours ago when Havershaw's analysis of your household logistics records revealed distribution patterns that did not correspond to agricultural output. You embedded a communication system inside famine relief infrastructure." He paused. "I underestimated you." 3 words she had waited 7 years to hear, and they meant nothing, because the man saying them was not offering recognition. He was performing the tactical acknowledgement a commander extends to a worthy adversary before the final engagement. Respect as a prelude to annihilation. "The letters are already beyond the capital," Eveline said. Her voice held steady through a throat tight with adrenaline. 12 provinces. By tomorrow, every governor in the empire will have evidence of your coup. It does not matter what happens in this tunnel." "It matters to me." "Why?" Caedric took 1 step forward. His boots echoed. "Because 30 years of military service taught me that the outcome of every campaign is decided in the final moment of direct contact between commanders. Not in logistics, not in intelligence, not in positioning." Another step. "In the moment when 2 people who understand each other completely stand close enough to see the truth in each other's eyes, and one of them blinks." He was 10 feet away now, close enough for torchlight to carve every line of his face into sharp relief. The scar beneath his eye, the gray at his temples, the jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and behind his eyes, behind the strategy, behind the control, behind decades of armor built from discipline and distance, something that looked terrifyingly like exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a body that needed sleep, the exhaustion of a soul that had been running from something for so long it had forgotten what it was running toward. "You could have let me take the throne," he said quietly. Only she could hear him now. The tunnel compressed their voices into something private. "I would have rebuilt this empire, ended the corruption, ended the decay, given the province's stability they have not known in generations. Under your control. Under competent control. Is that worse than what exists now? An aging emperor surrounded by parasites? Noble houses bleeding the treasury? Military campaigns fought for political vanity rather than strategic necessity? You did not start a revolution, Caedric. You started a coup. The difference is who benefits. Everyone benefits when the strong lead. Everyone suffers when the strong cannot stop." The words landed in the stone corridor like a blade dropped point first into earth. Caedric's jaw flexed. Something moved across his face. Fast, deep, immediately suppressed. And Eveline recognized it because she had spent 7 years cataloging every microscopic expression this man's face produced. Pain. Not physical. The other kind. The kind that lives in the space between who a person believes they are and who they have actually become. Eveline stepped forward. Every guard on both sides tensed. Hands tightened on weapons. The tunnel air thickened with the particular electricity that precedes violence. Ions charged. Bodies coiled. Nervous systems screaming at maximum alert. She stopped 3 feet from her husband. "I loved you," she said. Not loudly, not theatrically. With the flat, burned clean honesty of a person who has lost everything and discovered that the absence of pretense is the only freedom that survives total destruction. "For years I loved you, and you fed that love into your machine the way you fed soldiers into your campaigns, expendable resources consumed for strategic objectives." Her eyes did not waver. "But I'm not expendable anymore. And neither is this empire. And you are going to have to decide, but right here, right now, in this tunnel, with no audience and no court and no history watching, whether the man you actually are is capable of something you have never done in your entire life." And what is that? Stopping. The word hung between them. Behind Caedric, soldiers shifted. Behind Eveline, guards adjusted grips on swords. The tunnel held its breath the way a battlefield holds its breath, in the fraction of silence between the last artillery round and the infantry charge. Caedric stared at her, and she saw it happen. The calculation, the assessment, the strategic mind that had conquered 14 territories and designed the most ambitious coup in imperial history, now turning its full analytical power inward, measuring not terrain or troop positions but the architecture of its own nature, asking itself for perhaps the first time whether the structure it had built over decades of ruthless self-construction could survive the weight of one honest question from the one person it had never successfully reduced to a variable. His hand moved to his belt, where his sword hung. 50 Imperial guards raised weapons. 40 Valecrest soldiers drew steel. The tunnel filled with the metallic chorus of blades clearing scabbards, the sound ricocheting off stone walls until it became omnidirectional, sourceless, everywhere at once. And Caedric Valecrest's fingers closed around the hilt of his sword in a tunnel beneath the empire he had spent his entire life trying to own. 3 feet from the woman he had spent 7 years trying to erase, with the future of a dynasty balanced on the distance between drawing the blade and letting go. His fingers stayed on the hilt for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is nothing in ordinary time. A breath, a blink. The interval between one heartbeat and the next. But in a stone tunnel with 90 armed soldiers compressed into a corridor, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, with torchlight throwing every face into sharp amber relief and steel already cleared from scabbards on both sides, 3 seconds stretched into something geological. Entire eras of decision compressed into the space between one pulse and the next. Eveline did not step back. She watched his hand the way she had learned to watch his hands across 7 years of silent observation. The micro-tensions in his tendons, the pressure distribution across his knuckles, the angle of his wrist that telegraphed intent before conscious thought completed its journey from brain to muscle. His grip was wrong for drawing. She saw it immediately. A man drawing a sword in combat wraps his fingers from the bottom of the hilt upward, generating torque for the pull. Caedric's hand had closed around the grip from above, stabilizing, holding, the posture of a man reaching for something familiar because his body needed an anchor while his mind processed information it had never encountered before. He was not preparing to fight. He was holding on. The tunnel breathed around them, torches guttered in imperceptible drafts moving through stone. Water dripped somewhere behind the Valecrest line with metronomic indifference. "You know what happens if I draw this sword," Caedric said. His voice was quiet. Not the strategic quiet of a man controlling a room, something rawer. The quiet of a man standing at the edge of a cliff measuring the distance to the bottom. "Everyone in this tunnel dies," Eveline answered. "Not everyone. Enough. Enough to start a war you cannot win. The letters are gone, Caedric. 12 provinces by tomorrow. Every governor, every noble house, every military commander not already sworn to you. Your coup was designed for secrecy. The secrecy is over. Coups can survive exposure if the force behind them is decisive enough. Yours cannot. You know it cannot. You built your entire career on the principle that military force without political legitimacy creates resistance that eventually consumes the occupier. You taught that principle to a generation of officers. You wrote it into the Western campaign doctrines. And now you are standing in a tunnel considering whether to violate your own strategic philosophy because a woman you underestimated built a grain network you did not notice. His jaw tightened. The scar beneath his eye caught torchlight, and for a moment the shadow it threw made his face look cracked, fractured along a line so fine nobody would have seen it in daylight. But here, underground, in this amber half-dark where every surface told the truth, the fracture was visible. "You are asking me to surrender," he said. "I am asking you to stop." The difference being, surrender means someone else decides your future. Stopping means you decide it yourself. Silence. 40 Valecrest soldiers stood rigid behind their duke. 50 Imperial guards stood rigid behind their Duchess. The air between the two lines hummed with the accumulated tension of men trained for violence, waiting for the single word or gesture that would convert potential energy into kinetic destruction. Caedric looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the war chamber, measuring, calculating, cataloging weaknesses. Not the way he had looked at her in the Great Hall, controlling, managing, directing the interrogation toward predetermined conclusions. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has seen clearly for the first time after years of examining it through instruments that distorted every measurement. "If I stop," he said slowly, "everything I built disappears. Everything you built was built on people who did not choose to carry it. Your armies, your alliances, your wife. None of us were partners. We were materials, and structures built from materials that do not consent eventually collapse regardless of the architect's skill. Philosophy. Experience. 7 years of it." His hand was still on the sword. She could see the conflict in his body now. Visible, physical, expressed through the competing tensions of muscles trained for action and a mind encountering a situation no training had prepared it for. Caedric Valecrest had spent his entire adult life in environments where problems resolved through force, strategy, or both. He had conquered territories, dismantled enemies, orchestrated the most complex military operations of his era. Every challenge he had ever faced had a solution that began with assessment and ended with decisive action. This challenge did not, because the obstacle was not external, not a fortification to breach, or a supply line to sever, or an enemy commander to outmaneuver. The obstacle was the architecture of his own nature. 30 years of construction, layer upon layer of strategic identity built over the soft core of whoever he had been before the armor went on. And no amount of force could breach a wall that existed inside the person applying the force. Evelyn watched the realization move through him. Not instantly, not like a light switching on, more like ice thawing. Imperceptible at first, then accelerating, then unstoppable once the structural integrity of the frozen surface began to fail. His grip on the sword loosened, not all at once. Finger by finger. The way a man releases something he has held so long his hand has forgotten the shape of its own emptiness. The pommel cleared his palm, his hand dropped to his side, and Duke Caedric Valecrest exhaled. A single breath, but it carried the weight of something enormous leaving his body. Not air, not tension, but the particular density of a decision that had been deferred for so long it had calcified into identity. He had been holding that breath, Evelyn realized, not for 3 seconds in a tunnel, for years, for decades. Since the first moment a young officer discovered that discipline could replace vulnerability and decided the trade was worth making. "Stand down," he said. His voice broke on the second word. Nobody moved. "Stand down." Louder now, the command voice, the general's register that had ended rebellions and silenced throne rooms, but damaged, cracked at the edges like ceramics that have been fired too hot. Behind him, soldiers hesitated, looked at each other, looked at their commander. The confusion was visible. These were men trained to follow orders from a man who had never given an order that did not advance his strategic position. An order to stand down in a tunnel where the enemy stood exposed and outnumbered contradicted every operational instinct their training had installed. But they were his soldiers. And soldiers, in the end, obey. Swords returned to scabbards. The metallic sound cascaded through the tunnel like a steel river reversing course. Shoulders dropped. Hands released hilts. The molecular structure of imminent violence dissipated the way storms dissipate. Not all at once, but in stages. Pressure releasing in waves until the air became breathable again. On Evelyn's side, Voss held his position for a long, measured moment, reading the room, reading Caedric's face, making the calculation that chancellors make when the future of an empire depends on correctly interpreting whether a general's surrender is genuine or tactical. Then Voss sheathed his own sword and nodded once to the guard line behind him. Weapons lowered. The tunnel exhaled. They emerged from those waterworks into pre-dawn darkness. Snow had begun falling while they were underground. Heavy, wet, the kind that muffled sound and transformed the capital's streets into something softer and less certain than the city they had left. Torchlight from street lamps created amber halos in the falling white. The merchants' quarter stood quiet around them, its shuttered buildings and empty market stalls indifferent to the political earthquake occurring in their basement. Caedric walked beside Evelyn. Not behind her, not in front. Beside. No soldiers flanked him. He had ordered his men to remain in the tunnel and surrender their weapons to the Imperial Guard in groups of 10. The logistics of disarmament in a confined space would take hours. He did not stay to supervise, because supervision was control, and control was the mechanism he had just relinquished, and the only way to relinquish it genuinely was to stop exercising it immediately, totally, without the graduated transition a strategic mind would prefer. Cold surgery, the kind that hurts precisely because it is fast. They walked in silence through falling snow. Evelyn's boots left tracks in the accumulating white. Caedric's boots left tracks beside hers. Parallel, close. The geometry of two people moving in the same direction for the first time in their shared history. Voss followed at a distance with the guard escort. Seraphine walked supported between two soldiers, her face lifted to the snow as though the cold against her skin was the first sensation she had trusted in months. "The provincial governors will receive the letters by noon," Evelyn said. Caedric nodded, staring ahead. His face in the snow-filtered lamplight looked older than his years, stripped. The strategic mask that had served as his primary interface with the world for 3 decades had been removed, and what remained beneath it was not the monster the Empire feared or the legend his campaigns had constructed. Just a man. Tired. 46. Walking through snow in a city he had tried to seize and failed, and would now have to face as a citizen rather than a conqueror. "The Emperor will demand a tribunal," Evelyn continued. "Yes. You will be charged with treason. Yes. The sentence for treason is death." Caedric walked 3 more steps before answering. "I know." His voice carried no self-pity, no dramatic resignation, the flat acknowledgement of a man who understood cause and consequence the way engineers understood load and stress. He had applied force in a direction the structure could not sustain. The structure's response was predictable. Complaining about the physics was beneath his intelligence. "I will speak at your tribunal," Evelyn said. He looked at her then. For the first time since the tunnel, his eyes carried something other than exhaustion. Confusion. "Why?" "Because the Empire needs to understand what happened here. Not the political version, not the court gossip version, the real version. A man who served this empire for 30 years and was never taught that service could include anything except domination. A system that rewarded conquest so completely that the most talented strategist of his generation could not imagine building something without first destroying something else." She paused. "You are not the only problem, Caedric. You are the symptom of an empire that has confused strength with value for so long it cannot recognize either one accurately." "That sounds dangerously close to defending me." "It is dangerously close to the truth, which is not the same thing." They reached the trade office at the corner of the merchant's quarter square. A small stone building with a single lamp burning in the upper window, the signal Evelyn had established with her relief coordinators for emergency communication readiness. She stopped. Caedric stopped beside her. Snow accumulated on his shoulders, melted in his dark hair, ran down his face in thin rivulets that looked, in the amber lamplight, uncomfortably like tears. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "That night in your chambers. When I told you I stopped seeing you years ago." He swallowed. The movement was visible in his throat, the mechanical effort of forcing words through a channel that had spent decades restricting their flow. "I told you that you never demanded to be seen, that a man like me would devour anyone who did not force him to stop." "I remember." "I said it as a farewell." as an explanation for why the marriage had failed, as though the failure was your responsibility because you did not resist me hard enough. He turned to face her fully. The snow fell between them in slow, heavy curtains. It was the cruelest thing I have ever said to another human being, and I have said things that ended lives. Evelyn looked at him standing in the snow outside a grain distribution office at 5 in the morning while his empire collapsed around him. This man who had terrified nations, who had built and destroyed more than most people could imagine, who had entered her life as an arrangement and spent 7 years treating her as infrastructure and 3 days trying to use her as a detonation device. This man who had just surrendered his sword in a tunnel because a woman asked him to stop. "I know," she said. "I do not expect forgiveness." "Good, because I am not offering it." The words were blunt, unadorned, delivered with the same stripped-clean honesty she had discovered in herself somewhere between the Great Hall and the tunnel. The voice of a woman who had lost enough that gentleness had become a luxury she could no longer subsidize. But she was not finished. Forgiveness is not something I owe you and not something you can earn through a single decision in a tunnel. What you did, to me, to Seraphine, to Margot, to this empire, took years to build. Undoing it will take years, maybe longer, maybe never completely. She stepped closer. But I will tell the tribunal the truth, all of it, including the parts that explain you without excusing you. Because this empire needs to understand the machinery that produced Caedric Valecrest, not just the damage that machinery caused. Otherwise, it will produce another one. Caedric looked at her for a long time. The snow between them thickened. The lamp in the trade office window flickered. "You would have been a remarkable empress," he said quietly. "I would have been a miserable empress. Empresses serve thrones. I am finished serving things that do not serve back." Something crossed his face then, small, almost invisible beneath the snow and the shadows and the exhaustion. But she caught it because she had spent 7 years training her eyes on this face, and the training did not disappear simply because the context had changed. A smile. Not the strategic smile he deployed in negotiations, not the controlled expression he wore at state functions. A real one. Brief and broken, and carrying the particular sadness of a man recognizing beauty in something he destroyed. "What will you do?" he asked. "Rebuild. The provinces hit hardest by your troop movements will need food stabilization. The trade routes you disrupted for military logistics will need restoration. The noble houses that fractured during this crisis will need mediation. Domestic infrastructure. Yes, the kind you always considered beneath your attention. The kind that saved an empire tonight." She did not smile, but something in her eyes softened half a degree. "Yes," she said, "that kind." The tribunal convened 6 weeks later in the Imperial Court of Justice. Caedric Valecrest stood before the assembled judges, nobles, military commanders, and provincial representatives in the same black coat he had worn the night he surrendered, as though changing clothes would constitute a dishonesty he was no longer willing to practice. The charges were read: treason, conspiracy, subversion of military command, abuse of imperial authority, each one documented with evidence from the letters Evelyn's grain network had distributed across 12 provinces in under 48 hours. The trial lasted 9 days. Generals Crow and Roan testified against their former commander in exchange for reduced sentences. The predictable defection of men whose loyalty had always been transactional, and who, when the transaction reversed with it. General Drummond testified from a position of imperial commendation, her years of covert intelligence service recognized publicly for the first time. Seraphine testified on the 4th day. She wore a plain gray dress. No jewelry, no elaborate hair. She spoke for 3 hours about the coerced alliance, the manufactured romance, the staged Banquet scandal, the financial enslavement of her family through military debts designed to create leverage. Her voice broke twice. Both times she stopped, breathed, and continued. The court watched a woman they had dismissed as a mistress reveal herself as a prisoner. Margot testified on the 6th day. She confirmed 14 months of surveillance, detailed every report she had filed with Havershaw, described the recruitment, how the Duke's chief of staff had identified her financial vulnerabilities during her 2nd year of service and offered a compensation package that tripled her official salary in exchange for weekly intelligence reports on the Duchess's activities, emotional state, and private communications. When asked why she had continued for so long, Margot's answer was simple. Because I convinced myself the information was harmless. Household observations, daily routines, personal moods. It felt like gossip, not espionage. By the time I understood what it was actually being used for, I was too deep to surface without drowning. She looked toward Evelyn in the gallery. Evelyn looked back. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them looked away. Some ruptures do not heal, they scar. And scars are not failures of recovery. They are proof that recovery happened despite damage significant enough to be permanent. Evelyn testified on the 8th day. She spoke for 5 hours. She described the marriage, the years of administrative service, the gradual erosion of personhood that occurs when someone lives inside the orbit of a personality powerful enough to bend reality around its own gravity. She described the banquet, the discovery, the alliance with Seraphine, the betrayal by Margot, the tunnel. Then she described Caedric, not as a villain, not as a victim, as a product, a man manufactured by a system that rewarded dominance so extravagantly and punished vulnerability so ruthlessly that the most gifted mind of his generation had concluded, logically, strategically, with the same brilliant analysis he applied to everything, that human connection was a liability and emotional honesty was a tactical error. This empire built Caedric Valecrest, she told the court. We celebrated his conquests. We promoted his ruthlessness. We called his inability to connect with other human beings discipline and his destruction of everything that threatened his control strength. We rewarded every quality that eventually produced the coup and punished every quality that might have prevented it. She paused. Sentencing him to death solves nothing. It silences the symptom. The disease remains. The court murmured. Nobles shifted. Judges exchanged glances. I am not asking for mercy, Evelyn continued. I am asking for precision. Punish the crime accurately. Acknowledge the system that produced it honestly. And build something afterward that does not require another Caedric Valecrest to function. The sentence was life imprisonment. Not death, not exile. Not the public execution that half the empire demanded and the other half dreaded. The northern fortress of Dreadmarrow, a coastal garrison built on black cliffs where winter storms battered stone walls 9 months of the year. Isolated, secure. The kind of prison designed not for punishment but for containment, holding something too dangerous to release and too significant to destroy. Caedric accepted the sentence without visible reaction. He stood in the courtroom while the judgment was read, and his expression carried nothing the assembled witnesses could interpret. Not defiance, not defeat, not relief. The absolute stillness of a man who had finally stopped performing for an audience because the performance, at last, was over. The months that followed were quiet, in the particular way that aftermath is quiet. Not peaceful, but exhausted. The empire breathed the shallow, careful breaths of a body recovering from surgery. Provinces stabilized slowly. Trade routes reopened. Noble houses that had fractured during the crisis began the delicate, grudging process of reassembling alliances from wreckage. The emperor abdicated in spring, not dramatically, not in disgrace, with the measured withdrawal of a man who understood that surviving a crisis did not qualify him to lead the recovery. The provincial council assumed temporary governance, a committee structure Evelyn helped design, drawing on 7 years of experience managing distributed authority across territories too diverse for centralized control. Seraphine Vey returned to her family's eastern estates. Her testimony had dissolved the military debts Caedric had weaponized against her house. She left the capital on a clear morning in early spring without public ceremony, riding in a simple carriage with the windows open so the wind caught her hair. She looked, for the first time since Evelyn had known her, like a woman traveling towards something instead of away. Margot disappeared. Not dramatically, not into hiding. She simply resigned from the Valecrest household, left the capital, and was not heard from again. Evelyn received a single letter 3 months later, unsigned, postmarked from a coastal town in the southern provinces. 2 sentences. I garden now. The things I grow do not report to anyone. Evelyn read it at her desk in the provincial council offices. The same desk where, a lifetime ago, she had reviewed grain distribution reports while her marriage burned quietly around her. She set the letter aside, did not respond. Some connections survive betrayal, and some do not, and the difference is not always a matter of willingness. Sometimes two people simply cannot find their way back to the place where trust lived because the geography itself has changed. The roads that once connected them now lead somewhere else, and that is not a tragedy. It is a landscape adjusting to tectonic shift. It is the ground settling into its new configuration after the earthquake, finding its own stability, asking nobody's permission. Evelyn visited Dreadmarrow once. Late autumn, almost a year after the tribunal. She traveled north by carriage through provinces she had helped stabilize, past grain warehouses bearing the relief coordination marks she had designed during the floods, past roadside stations staffed by administrators who waved as her carriage passed because they recognized the woman who had kept them fed during the worst winter in a generation. The fortress stood on a headland above a dark sea, black stone, iron gates, wind that cut through clothing and found skin and settled there like something that intended to stay. She was escorted through 3 checkpoints and 2 locked corridors to a room with a single window, a table, 2 chairs, and a view of waves breaking against cliffs in repetitive, endless percussion. Caedric was already seated when she entered. He looked different, not diminished in the way she had expected, not broken or hollowed or reduced to a smaller version of the man she had known. Different in a way that took her several seconds to identify because the change was structural rather than superficial. He was still. Not the controlled stillness he had cultivated as a strategic tool, the immobility of a commander holding space through sheer density of presence. This was different, quieter. The stillness of a man who had stopped performing entirely because the audience was gone. The stage was gone. The production itself had closed, and what remained was just a person sitting in a room with stone walls and sea air and nothing to conquer. His hair had gone grayer. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, visible, open, the fingers relaxed in a posture she had never once seen in 7 years of marriage. Caedric's hands had always been instruments, gripping, gesturing, directing, controlling. These hands were just resting. He stood when she entered, not sharply, not with the military precision that had characterized every movement he made in his former life. He stood slowly, the way a person stands when they want to show respect without performing it. Evelyn. Her name and his voice sounded different now. Not because his voice had changed, because the intent behind it had. For 7 years, her name in his mouth had been a label, a shorthand for the functional role she occupied in his operational structure. Now it was just a name. A word that meant a specific person, nothing more, nothing less. Caedric. They sat across from each other. The table between them was narrow enough that their hands could have touched if either of them had extended their fingers. Neither did. The provincial council sent their quarterly report, Evelyn said. The eastern trade routes are fully operational. Southern grain production is exceeding pre-crisis levels. The military restructuring is ahead of schedule. Caedric listened. His expression carried attention without the strategic processing that had always accompanied it, not calculating implications, not mapping leverage points, just listening. General Drummond is overseeing the restructuring personally, Evelyn continued. She is thorough. Something flickered in his eyes. Not bitterness, recognition. She was always the best of them, he said. I should have seen that what made her excellent also made her impossible to own. You should have seen a lot of things. Yes. No defense, no qualification, no strategic reframing of the admission to preserve some portion of his legacy. Just agreement. The shortest, hardest word in any language for a man who had spent his life constructing elaborate justifications for every decision he ever made. Silence filled the room. But it was different from the silences of their marriage. Those suffocating, weaponized absences of communication that had functioned as control mechanisms. This silence had space in it, air, the neutral stillness of two people who had exhausted every form of performance and found themselves, perhaps for the first time, simply present in the same room without agenda. I have a question, Caedric said. Ask. He looked at the table, at his own hands resting on its surface, then at her. In the tunnel, when you asked me to stop. He paused, chose his next words with the care of someone who has recently learned that words carry consequences he can no longer manage. Did you believe I would? Evelyn considered the question. She could give him the kind answer, the answer that rewrote history into something gentler, claiming she had seen the good in him all along, believed in his capacity for change, trusted that the man beneath the strategist still possessed whatever fragment of humanity makes stopping possible. She could give him the strategic answer, that she had calculated the probabilities, assessed his psychological state, determined that the combination of exhaustion, exposure, and her specific rhetorical approach had a reasonable chance of producing compliance. She gave him the true answer. No, I thought you would draw the sword. I thought everyone in that tunnel was going to die. I asked you to stop because it was the right thing to ask, not because I believed it would work. Caedric absorbed this. His eyes changed, not dramatically, a slight deepening. The kind of shift that happens when a person receives a piece of information that reorganizes their understanding of an event they thought they had fully processed. You stood 3 feet from a man you believed was about to kill you, he said, and you asked him to stop, knowing it would not work. Yes. Why? Because the woman I was becoming would have asked, and I decided to be her whether it worked or not. Caedric looked at her for a long time. Outside, waves struck the cliffs. The sound entered the room through the single window and filled the space between them with rhythmic, ancient, indifferent percussion. The sea had been hitting those rocks for thousands of years. It would continue for thousands more. Empires rose and fell, and the water did not notice. You are the bravest person I have ever known, he said. The words were quiet, undecorated, delivered with the particular weight of a statement a man has been carrying inside his chest for months and has finally found the precise moment to release. Evelyn's eyes stung. She did not cry, but the sting was there. The physiological recognition that something true had been spoken by someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding truth, and the collision between habitual distrust and genuine recognition created a sensation the body did not quite know how to process. I need to leave soon, she said. I know. The council session resumes tomorrow. The Northern Province dispute needs mediation before the first snow. You will resolve it? You resolve everything. She almost smiled. Not everything. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the narrow table in a stone room at the edge of the world, while the sea pounded cliffs below and the autumn light through the window turned everything gold and gray simultaneously. I will not come back, Evelyn said. The words cost something. She felt the expenditure in her chest, a compression, a tightening, the physical toll of severing the last connective thread between herself and a man who had defined her world for nearly a decade. Not because she still loved him. She was no longer certain what she felt for Caedric Valecrest could be categorized that simply. Love, resentment, grief, recognition, exhaustion, respect. All of it layered so densely that separating individual emotions was like trying to identify individual waves in a storm. The whole was not reducible to its parts, but she knew with the clarity that only complete devastation produces that moving forward required releasing the last handhold on the structure that had collapsed. Not forgetting, not forgiving, releasing. The way a climber releases a broken rope, not because the rope does not matter, but because holding it means falling. Caedric nodded. I know, he said again. He walked around the table, stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat and the lines around his eyes and the gray in his hair and every detail of a face she had studied for 7 years and would probably carry in her memory for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not. He extended his hand, not to touch her face, not to grip her shoulder, not any of the possessive gestures that had characterized every physical interaction of their marriage. He offered his hand the way strangers do when meeting for the first time. Evelyn looked at it, then she took it. His grip was firm, warm, the calluses from decades of sword work still rough against her palm. But the pressure was calibrated differently than she had ever felt from him. Not controlling, not directing, not communicating dominance through physical contact, just holding, the simplest form of human connection. 2 hands meeting because that is what hands can do when they stop trying to own what they touch. They held for 3 seconds, then released. Eveline turned and walked to the door, opened it. stepped into the stone corridor where guards waited and cold air moved, and the rest of her life extended outward, like a road she could finally see, because no one was standing in front of her blocking the view. She did not look back, not because looking back would have weakened her, not because she was performing strength for an audience that no longer existed, because the woman she had become in the months since a dark tunnel and a falling sword and a grain network that saved an empire. That woman looked forward, not as a philosophy, not as a principle, as a practice, the daily, unglamorous, stubbornly ordinary act of facing the direction where new things could be built instead of the direction where old things still smoldered. Outside Dreadmarrow, autumn wind hit her face, cold, salt-smelling, carrying the sound of waves against stone. Her carriage waited on the cliff road. The driver stood beside the horses, collar turned up against the wind, breath pluming white. Eveline climbed in, settled against the seat, drew a woolen blanket across her legs. The carriage jolted forward. Wheels found the road south, the road back toward provinces that needed feeding and trade routes that needed mending and a governance council that needed a woman who understood that the most important structures in any civilization are the ones nobody celebrates because they are too busy being essential. Through the carriage window, the northern sea stretched to the horizon. Gray water, gray sky. The line between them invisible, indistinguishable, as though the world had decided that boundaries were optional and everything was allowed to flow into everything else without borders or permission. Eveline watched the sea until Dreadmarrow disappeared behind the headland. Then she opened her satchel, removed a stack of provincial reports, found a pen, and began the work of building something that did not require anyone's destruction to exist. The carriage moved south, the sea moved against the cliffs, and the Empire, slowly, imperfectly, with the stubborn patience of a thing that has been shattered and is learning to hold together using different architecture than before, the Empire continued.